been finding the presentations, as my colleague Yatsantis said, there is this common thread running through all the presentations. So when we hear Mrs. Pat Smith was speaking about the myth of the wall and the humanitarian situation in Gaza and a lot of the divestment initiatives in the church meetings, and they are based on claims about things going on in the region, where are these claims coming from? And in almost, I would say, at least 90%, if not 100% of those claims originate from non-governmental organizations. And that's what my organization does. We research those groups that are active in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and more importantly, who's funding those organizations and what are the agendas behind those active in those campaigns. Now, Yitz briefly mentioned the Durban Conference. Our organization was founded in the aftermath of that conference. And if you all remember, there was a lot of media surrounding it at the time. It basically devolved into an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic hate fest. The United States government and the Israeli government walked out of the conference, and the Canadians and the Europeans were left trying to salvage what was left of it. But that was the diplomatic side. But really the main driving force of the Durban Conference was the NGO forum. And at that forum, more than 5,000 representatives from more than 1,500 NGOs gathered and came up with what we call the Durban Strategy. And here are just some images of some of the protests that were going on in the streets of Durban at the NGO forum, as well as a flyer that was passed out showing Hitler and saying what would happen if Hitler had won. There would be no Israel. And the NGO forum issued a declaration basically laying out a strategy for how they were going to attack the right to Jewish self-determination. And what's interesting about this phenomenon is prior to this time, although I would say it probably started in the 1990s in the aftermath of the Cold War and the fall of apartheid South Africa, these efforts to delegitimize Israel before were primarily carried out by states, by the Arab League, by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, now Cooperation. And they had things such as the 1975 Zionism is Racism declaration by the General Assembly, boycotts, and similar initiatives. But in 2001, the torch was passed, and the soft power war was taken up by civil society organizations claiming to have a human rights and humanitarian mandate. And their strategy was to, by using the terms of human rights and international law, ethnic cleansing, racism, war crimes, to isolate Israel as an apartheid state through the use of boycotts and other methods. And in the aftermath of that strategy, this process over the past decade has played itself out in many ways. And we've seen it in what was mentioned by Manfred, the Jenin massacre claims, 2004, the International Court of Justice opinion against Israel's security barrier, the 2006 Lebanon war, the 2008 incident in Beit Hanun, the 2009 Gaza war and the resulting Goldstone report, the flotilla in 2010, and now we see initiatives relating to settlements. And the way that this strategy works is you'll have non-governmental organizations that are, and I'm not saying that all organizations are involved in this process, but many of them are, and many very well-known organizations. What they do is they'll issue claims invoking international law, human rights, purporting to have military or strategic expertise, which they don't have. These claims are then adopted in the media without any sort of verification as to the veracity of these claims, no underlying investigation of the agendas motivating these groups, who are the people making these claims. And then those media claims and NGO claims are then utilized in UN frameworks, primarily the Human Rights Council. We heard a little bit about the UN. I don't know if you all know, but Israel is the only country with a standing agenda item at the Human Rights Council. There's one agenda item for every other country in the world, and agenda item 7 is only for abuses committed by Israel against the Palestinians. That's our Human Rights Council. In March 2012, the Human Rights Council issued a resolution condemning the treatment of Syrian in Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Okay, that was, you know, what's going on in Syria today. But that's our Human Rights Council. And many of the organizations I'm going to be talking about are complicit in that process. They lobby for these things at the UN, and they're also very active in lobbying for similar types of one-sided inquiries in European parliaments. Just last week, there was an initiative by 22 humanitarian NGOs to ban settlement products completely. I've never seen any of these groups get together to have a session in the EU Parliament about Syria, women's rights, or religious freedom in Saudi Arabia. Pretty much every month at the UK, these groups are having parliamentary sessions to try to get boycott, arms embargoes imposed against Israel, same thing in Ireland, and many other European countries. And then finally, these claims are picked up in academia, where the whole cycle gets repeated, and these types of claims become the standard narrative. We've all spoken a lot about narrative, and this is really the origin of that narrative. Now, some people might say, oh, you know, this is a bunch of crazy marginal groups, who cares what they have to say? Now, of course, you know, and who cares? Okay, the European Parliament comes out with something, and there's a famous Israeli expression, shmoom, which is basically, is UN in Hebrew, like, who cares what the UN has to say? But these also have consequences beyond the publicity aspects and these statements. For instance, we've spoken a lot about BDS, and while to date the BDS movement has not been very successful, there's always the chance that there will be, and we've heard a little bit about how that might be changing in some of the denominations, which could have a severe economic impact. And I think in terms of the way that a lot of these groups are operating now is they're going to try to go after settlement products. There's a big movement right now with organizations to either ban or do labeling of settlement products. But that's really just a pretext, because their ultimate goal is really to boycott Israel as a whole, to end Jewish self-determination rights, and they're just using the settlements in order to get at that, because it's, you know, it's more politically acceptable. Another major impact of these campaigns is what I have deemed lawfare. And I passed out a few copies of my monograph that I wrote a few years ago on this topic. If there weren't enough copies, if you look on our website, it's available there for free, and we have many other interesting, I hope, reports on similar topics. And lawfare includes campaigns at the ICJ, the International Criminal Court, the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Treaty bodies at the UN, and of course the national courts, where human rights organizations have tried to have Israeli leaders arrested. So up until last year, when the UK amended its law, no Israeli official could go to the UK for fear of being arrested. Tzipi Livni, Ehud Barak, Shimon Peres. The UK was trying to have a lot of high-level anti-terror meetings, security meetings, diplomatic meetings, and no Israeli delegation could go to the United Kingdom for fear when they stepped off the plane, they were going to be led away in handcuffs to a British jail. And the same problem is going on in the Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, Spain, Norway, and the list goes on and on. Again, these attempts have not been successful to date. However, again, it only takes one. And when you have one, that can lead to opening the floodgates. As I was saying, not every organization is involved in it, but these are some of the groups that are leading this campaign in conjunction with many local NGOs. And if you'll see that their budgets, these are hugely influential and powerful groups. Their budgets rival that of international corporations. You know, Oxfam International, $528 million budget. It was funny, a few months ago I did a search on Oxfam's website. I could not find one document related to Syria. And if you put Israel in, you'll come up with dozens of documents. So they use this money to carry out the Durban strategy. And basically what they do is they'll make unverifiable or unsourced claims, usually related in the context of military operations. Oftentimes they'll rely on eyewitnesses or people found with unknown ties to terror groups like Hezbollah or Hamas. The context of terror is completely erased. If it is mentioned, it's often well, Israel has security needs, but And any way that Israel tries to defend itself against rockets, suicide bombings, it's always deemed illegal by these organizations. And they never offer any type of alternative. There's not one thing that Israel could do that in their eyes would be deemed legal. There's many distorted and false uses of international legal terms, such as disproportionate force or indiscriminate attacks on civilians. You often find selective use of data, Palestinian casualties. In the Gaza war, many of these organizations were claiming there were 1,400, 1,500 casualties, the vast majority of which, 90%, were civilians. These claims were then adopted in the media and in the Goldstone report. And then it turned out about a year later, the head of Hamas admitted that over 800 fighters had been killed. So you see, and those pretty much matched the numbers that the Israeli government had put out. But again, these claims are made and you don't see updates on their websites. A lot of these organizations promote a facade of objectivity and that they're doing, they're providing research. But yet you would think, so when they have these types of mistakes, they would try and correct the record and fix their website. But oftentimes these false claims remain. And of course, there's double standards and a selective focus on Israel compared to, and again, not to say that there aren't problems here that need fixing, because there definitely are, but in comparison, when you have 28,000 dead in Syria and 30,000 disappeared, that's a little bit different than whether or not a tomato should have a certain label on it. Now, why is this the case? Basically, we attribute it to something called the halo effect. And what the halo effect is that non-governmental organizations that claim to be promoting human rights or humanitarian values are cloaked with this veneer of morality. And they're seen to be more democratic, more grassroots, more authentic than government sources or international organizations. And therefore, the media then it does adopt those claims. And it also not only that they're given this cloak of morality, it also insulates them from scrutiny. And so no one's really digging, no one can believe that their claims wouldn't be credible because they're dealing with human rights. And so therefore, no one's taking the time to really investigate what's being said, who are these people. Here's one study that we did on Amnesty International. We basically just took their reports on the Middle East and just simply counted page numbers. And if you look, Israel, and there's Palestinian Authority, there are a few documents on the PA, but it's not many, basically had the most pages of any country in the Middle East for the past 7 years. And look at Syria on that list, 67 pages. UAE doesn't even register. Bahrain, which is having a huge crisis right now in the protests there, 0 pages. And I think that pretty much lays stark some of the double standards. And it's also important to note, and it's related to the halo effect as well, that these organizations also have a democratic deficit. They're not elected. They're not accountable to anybody except their donors, their members, and their board members. And so we don't know what the agendas of those people are. And so they take up specific issues because that's who they're beholden to. No one elects them or says, this is, the public as a whole isn't electing these people and saying, we want reporting on Israel. No, they're beholden to their own agendas. Another example, Human Rights Watch, just a few examples of publications in 2010. Again, Israel tops the list. And if you look in comparison, Libya, Syria, North Korea, Belarus, Somalia, Cuba. Again, it's the focus of the organization. And interestingly enough, if I put just Human Rights Watch's documents highlighting the Goldstone Report, promoting the Goldstone Report, and trying to have Israelis prosecuted at the International Criminal Court, that would become second after Israel. So there were more than 40 documents put out related to the Goldstone Report. So compare that to some of these other situations.
Can I just interrupt quickly and ask you, how many came out when Goldstone reversed the stand?
Well, right, they didn't even talk about it. Yeah, they ignore that. When the bad stuff comes out, they ignore it. And another thing they do is they profess to have expertise in military affairs, humanitarian law, and and national security. So here we have Mark Garlasco making claims about military operations. He was the senior military analyst of Human Rights Watch, and it turned out he actually was an obsessive collector of Nazi memorabilia. He wrote a 500-page book, collector's book on Nazi medals. And this was the person that was writing the reports on Israel and Israel's supposed war crimes. Now, I'm not claiming he was anti-Semitic. I've met him before. He probably actually isn't anti-Semitic. However, look at the appearance. You have someone who is obsessed with the Nazis writing the reports on Israel. What is that saying? And the rest of Human Rights Watch's Middle East department, over half of them have pro-Palestinian advocacy backgrounds. Same thing at Amnesty International. The researcher for Amnesty International on Israel, as well as in the US, are both former members of the International Solidarity Movement. One of those people was a human shield at the Church of the Nativity in 2002. And these are the people that have a facade of being objective researchers, but they're actually political advocates. I'm running out of time, so there's many more examples, and I passed out along some handouts before, highlighting some of them. Just quickly, I'll mention Human Rights Watch went to Saudi Arabia to raise money amongst Saudi elites in order to attack pro-Israel pressure groups. Human Rights Watch also was one of the main proponents of the Gaddafi regime as reformers. This was a year before Saif Islam stood on a truck with an automatic rifle saying he vowed to fight to the last man, woman, and bullet. Anti-Semitism, Badil. This is the picture on the left, or I guess your left. Won second prize in the right of return contest. And as you can see, this image is straight out of Der Stürmer. And Badil was funded by a consortium of the Swedish, Danish, Dutch, and Swiss governments, as well as some other church organizations, Dan Church Aid and Norwegian People's Aid, which I don't believe is a church organization, but also a Scandinavian group. And when we alerted them, the funding was frozen, so that was a positive development. But again, how did they get the money in the first place? Why was no one evaluating what this organization was doing? And there's many other examples on their website that are equally bad, and they're still there now. Another example you see in the bottom is a Christmas card that is for sale on War of Want of British NGOs website. And you can see the theological implications of that. Again, European governments give over 100 million euros a year to fund these organizations engaging in these campaigns. We've had some, and here's another great example, EU funded the Palestinian Center of Human Rights. And what did the PCHR do with that money? They held a conference on prosecution of Israeli war criminals, and it was broadcast live on Al Jazeera. So this is European taxpayer dollars going to this, and PCHR also used the money to try to have people arrested in the UK and Spain and Switzerland. Again, Holocaust inversion. Yit spoke a little bit about electronic Intifada. He makes statements such as, supporting Zionism is not atonement for the Holocaust, but it's continuation in spirit. And he's able to make these statements and disseminate them due to the amount of money they're getting from the Dutch government. And again, like I said, there's many other examples. Finally, people are waking up to this issue. Robert Bernstein, who was the founder of Human Rights Watch, in an op-ed in the New York Times in 2009, renounced his organization. It was very painful for him because finally he couldn't stand it anymore, the double standards. Goldstone realized he had been had, that he had been repeating lies fed to him by these organizations, retracted the slanderous claims in his report in a Washington Post op-ed. And we've put out a book on the Goldstone report highlighting how this process works. Again, it's available on our website. And in terms of looking at this from a more academic perspective, we've been involved for the past few years in a practice to try to develop standards for NGO fact-finding. And we had a book come out in April that highlights the preliminary aspects of our research. And we've also found that it's probably most acute in this region, but we found similar things in Colombia, in Africa and other Sri Lanka, other regions in the world. So it is a problem for this region, but it also is something that's a bigger problem. And again, I invite you all to go to our website to gather more information, and I'm happy, feel free to email me if you have any questions on specific groups or need more information. So thanks very much.